This is City Pulse Newsmakers, a weekly look at the issues and the people behind them in Greater Lansing. Brought to you by City Pulse, Lansing's weekly alternative newspaper. And now, here's your host, City Pulse publisher, Burl Schwartz.
Good morning. If you're a jazz fan, your favorite event might be the Summer Solstice Jazz Festival in East Lansing. It just gets better every year. Or maybe a jazzy little Christmas at MSU or the MLK program. Or if you're like me, you love those Friday nights when the jazz artist in residence plays with the MSU Jazz Orchestras. Our guest today is instrumental in all of them. He is the director of the Jazz Studies program at Michigan State, Professor Rodney Whitaker.
Thank you, Burl. Thanks for having me on your show.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here, Rodney. So I emphasize professor because you're a professor and you were the youngest distinguished professor ever honored. How'd you get to be a professor but no advanced degrees?
Well, you know what I think in music schools that's kind of normal. You know, part of the issue that you have is that, for example, say if I was a virtuoso violinist, you know, at college age, I would probably be on the circuit doing competitions rather than going to music school. So a lot of those folks, when they're 16, they show promise, they enter the competition circuit. So then, you know, from 16 to 20-something years old, they're trying to make a name for themselves. And then probably by early 20s, those folks are on tour playing. Mm-hmm. And so would you keep that person from teaching your violinist without a degree? So that's kind of the issue. And as universities started in the United States, that was kind of the norm. Like places like Juilliard conservatories didn't necessarily require the educators to have a degree because they wanted someone from the field who did it professionally. And early out, most of those places were 3-year schools. It wasn't about getting a degree; it's about getting the training so that you can go on to play. But that changed. You know, that changed probably in the '60s because we started DMA programs, you know, doctors, music and arts programs where people got PhDs in music and that sort of thing. So that kind of the thinking is that a person has to have a master's or a PhD because that's what you'd be granting. Right. People. But so what happened to me is when I was 26 years old, I started teaching. I came here to do a workshop, and the following fall I started teaching here, and that was 1994 as an adjunct faculty. And then the University of Michigan found out that I was teaching here, and then they offered me a job as adjunct faculty as well. So at 26, I started at U of M and Michigan State. Or maybe the next year, 95, I started at U of M. So I taught at 2 institutions, but it was just part-time and I was still traveling. At that time, I just started playing with Wynton Marsalis. And fast forward to 2000, Jim Forger, the director of music at the time, who's the dean now, offered me a job to be the director of jazz studies.
Yeah, you know, one of the things I love about seeing you live is I learn things about you. You talk to the audience, you know, you're not afraid to open up with them. And one of the things I learned was you always wanted to be a college professor.
Since I was a kid.
Yeah. Why was that?
Well, you know, I had this, I remember watching television as a kid, and I was always a person that liked to explain things to people. Like I remember when I first got into jazz, I was 13. And you couldn't be my friend if you didn't want to listen to me talk about jazz, because I was so excited about this medium, and I wanted everybody to know. And all my friends that I grew up with, even that weren't musicians, we spent a lot of time listening. And a lot of those guys are jazz fans now. But even younger than that, I remember watching television. There was a show about a law professor. I forget the name of the show.
The Paper Chase.
The Paper Chase. I used to watch that show.
Yeah, good show.
Because he would stand in the law lecture hall at Harvard, and he would give his, you know, lecture. And something about that, you know, that watching this guy communicate thoughts and ideas to hundreds of people in a lecture. I said, man, as a kid, I wanted to be that. And in fact, I started dressing like that. I used to buy all my clothes as a kid at Purple Heart, you know. secondhand
Yeah,
store.
is that right?
But I would always get the sport coats with the patches, and I wore sweater vests. And I'm talking about 10 years old. 10 years old, I used to wear a sweater vest, and I wore a shirt, like a collared shirt, to school every day. I dressed like a professor. Dress pants. I didn't wear tennis shoes. I wore dress shoes, and that's what I wanted to be from the time I was a kid.
That's incredible. And something else I learned about you, and I couldn't remember it as I was driving here today. What's that other thing that I learned about you when at the Rufus Reed night? And then I started thinking, and this will take a second to explain.
Sure.
So I started thinking, I wonder what Rodney's self-image is like. What does he like to wear? How does he think of himself? And I think, like, I like to wear a fedora because
Sure.
that's an old newspaper hat. And then it leaped to my mind, Dexter Gordon, and because I think he always had that hat.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Oh yeah.
So anyway, long story to ask you about.
But that's
Dexter Gordon.
But you know, when I discovered jazz, I discovered my fashion sense. Too, because what began to happen is, part of the beauty of studying jazz as a kid or getting into jazz as a kid is that you have the liner notes. And so you're reading about, so I could tell you any jazz musician, what city they're from, what high school they're
Like other kids memorize baseball statistics.
Right, I remember memorized the things about the jazz musicians. And the other thing that I got is looking at because part of, I always think that like photography and art, visual art and jazz kind of grew up together in American culture. You think about, Alfred Lion and all those folks at Blue Note that were great photographers who really got their craft together as a photographer, taking pictures of the jazz musician, especially the black and whites, looking at the clothes. And a lot of these guys were like, when you go back to Blue Note, 1939, there's the first session they're Sidney Bechet. They're taking photos of Sidney Bechet. So I could look at how these folks dress. I'm checking out, wow, man. I'm looking at the quality of the clothes. So I got into that as a young guy, just looking and I found that I couldn't find those clothes in the 80s. You couldn't find those kind of clothes unless you were rich. Yeah. So I would find things like that in second stores, even kind of the shoes that they wore. And so I got into clothes, and I think Dexter kind of his style with a beret. Mm-hmm. He lived in Paris. Kenny Clark is another. That whole kind of wintertime. I love winter because I can wear a long overcoat. Yeah. I can put on my beret and wrap the scarf and look like a Parisian.
So you sound like a guy who might have been comfortable in another era. Is there one that you think you would have loved living in?
I think what I think about, like, probably my favorite place on earth to spend time is Paris, and maybe I have an image of being an expatriate, like Dexter and those guys in the late 50s moving to Europe. I see that time, that era, or even thinking in the 1920s, Josephine Baker and living in Paris. I have images of that. But also, too, like I think that there's so many things about that culture, the French culture with food and drink and everything that it's about that kind of got me as a young man, because I started touring Europe when I was 20 with various different groups that I toured with, and always appreciating going to a place where they appreciate style, food, and Italy is certainly similar, but I think French people are connoisseurs of culture and jazz, and I felt at home.
You're an interesting, you have you're touching two ends of a rainbow, because, you talk about all your travels, and yet you're quite a family man. You've got 8 kids. You've been married.
7.
7.
8 with my son.
Okay, and you've been married for 30 years to the same person, Cookie, and it's interesting because what we see, usually the way jazz performers are depicted in the movies, it's no better than most newspaper men. Kind of, they have drug problems or alcohol problems, and how is it your upbringing, you think, or how did you end up being this jazz performer who's also a big family man?
Well, I think that I had good examples. You know, I had my mom and father were married for a long time. My father died when he was in his late 60s. And then also my wife, because my wife and I, Cookie, we grew up together. And so I think we're best friends, and we grew up together. And we also, her mother and father considered me their kid too. So part of it is the family upbringing and family being the most important part of my life. You know, people ask me how did I become so successful as a musician at a young age? And it was really because I was trying to figure out how I could take care of my kids. I had kids early. I was 18 when I had my first kid. And so how could I take care of my kids and still play music was always the question. And for a little while I worked a job. I had a job at a gas station cleaning and as a cashier. And then I tried to get enough money, make enough money as an artist. If I could make more than the job pays, and it didn't pay very much, minimum wage job, then I could quit the job. So I did, and I made it a full-time thing. I actually left school at 20 so I could pursue being a musician full-time, because I felt at the time the curriculum didn't really, what I wanted to be, there wasn't a program that at that point that was designed to help me become. So I created my own program, and I went home and I began to read, and I connected with artists. And one of the people I met in those early days was Tyree Guyton, the guy who has the Heidelberg Project. Right. And I used to go over in my bass, and he would paint, and we would hang and talk about music and art and culture. And the people that I met on Heidelberg Street was an education, because poets would come by, artists, other artists, poets, musicians. And that became my university, really, that just to sit with, I think of, can't remember all the names, some of the Detroit artists, some of them are kind of coming to my head, or John Sinclair would come by. And I'd talk about, he would tell me about the 60s, and then that would send me to want to read a book. I'm giving you a long explanation.
No, this is fascinating.
But it's really about the community I grew up in. Detroit nurtured me to be who I am and encouraged me to be a family man, because me and Cookie we're like inseparable. We're part of a team that people knew about even when we were young. And so people encouraged us to stay together and to work it out and to be, and we grew up in a great community that nurtured us to still be together.
Sense of community really comes through with you, and of course, as Larry Cosentino's written a couple of times, you turned down an opportunity to go to New York to run the Juilliard Jazz program. So I gather staying in this neck of the woods is important.
Well, I think that MSU is a special place. I think that it's a place that I think recognizes when you are committed, and they have really put a lot of resources behind us, really being able to fulfill our work and vision. My area, the Jazz Studies program and the music school. And I think that for me, that wasn't the same level of commitment. I think that being able to, with a group, I've been able to take my group to Japan on tour. I've been able, and with help from the university. We tour all over the Midwest. We tour the state of Michigan, every end of the state of Michigan. There's a commitment to working in Detroit. So every tour that you see, those Friday night concerts, usually they end on that tour ends on Sunday night in Detroit. So the kids are playing, from Ludington to Petoskey, East Lansing, Flint.
How do you get around?
Detroit. Dean Trailways.
Is there the old tour bus?
The old tour, and I got some of that idea came from Phil Woods. Phil Woods said if he wanted to create a university program where he would just put the kids on the bus, and the 15 weeks in the semester,
that'd be great.
We tour a different city every day. And the reality of school is you really can't do that, because they have liberal arts classes and other things, and academic classes, gen eds. So the reality is, how do we get that medium? We do it twice a year, twice a semester, and 5 days each time. So we're on the road. They're on the road at least 20, 25 days a year, which is a lot for a college kid. But a lot of the kids leave the program and they know that this is the lifestyle that they want. And when they go play, we have guys that play in the Count Basie Orchestra and other bands, and they fit in because they've already had.
Yeah.
The
When you're on the bus, is it like in the movies? The instruments are out, people are jamming.
No, it's not quite that way. What I try to do is we have a lot of videos that are playing, a lot of jazz things, jazz videos and informational things, but most of the time they're asleep. You know, some of
college kids.
Yeah, some of the students are reading, you know, kind of studying or whatever, but most of the time they're on the bus sleep, you know, because when we get to the school, it's full tilt. We get off the bus, we're doing workshops with the high school kids and rehearsing with the artists. So it's the itinerary in a day is pretty rigorous.
Do they get intimidated when suddenly they're playing with Russell Malone or they're playing with Rufus Reed? I mean, I would be intimidated.
No, I think that I think if you grow up in this program, by the time you made the top group, you've been playing with artists since you were a freshman.
Yeah.
So if you're in the third band, you know, a lot of programs, what they do is they don't allow the younger students to play with the artists. And what I decided when we got the grant to bring in the artists from the credit union, Michigan State Federal Credit Union, is that initially it was supposed to be the artist would only play with Jazz Orchestra 1. So you would come to the concert, you'd hear the first two bands, the first half, and then you'd hear the artist. But then I started thinking about that. I said, well, you know, as a student, that would be a great experience this doesn't happen anywhere else either, if you could play with the artist as an 18-year-old. What kind of encouragement would that give you to grow?
Yeah.
And what kind of exposure? You wouldn't get this kind of exposure at any other institution to be able to have this opportunity. So we tried it, and I think we first tried it when John Faddis came. And John Faddis, you know, a lot of artists, you know, come here, they only want to play with the best kind of deal. So we tried it with John Faddis. He's a great friend and really encourages young folks. He's a great person. So I said, John, would you play with the third and second band? Man, I'd love to. So he rehearsed with them, but the level of the performance of those two groups went to a higher level when they got, you know, so it was like an experiment that we learned from. So if they know at start of the year that they're going to play with John Faddis and Christian McBride and, you know, whoever it is, it's going to elevate their level. The auditions went up too, because people wanted to get in the top group, you know, because they want to be on tour.
Right.
Also, but even the level of the third band certainly, you know, went up because Mike Dees is certainly a great director, but also he has a kind of a carrot to help them get it together quicker, because this particular chart we're going to play with John Faddis, so they want to sound good. Yeah. The rehearsals are better, and people are just playing good. I mean,
and you like to play with some of these guys, because one of the highlights of this year for me was the duet you did with Russell Malone.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, the hush in the audience spoke volumes. I thought you could have heard a pin drop. A great moment. But did you plan that? Did he know?
The duet wasn't planned. It was really Russell saying, before the show started, saying, hey, I want to play something with you tonight. You know, let's play something. And so we kind of decided on the tune, and then we didn't rehearse or anything, and then we did it. But I've known Russell for almost 30 years, and I've recorded with him before. I played on one of his recordings early out called Holy Cats that he recorded for a Japanese label. And a lot, you know, because of my experience of touring and playing, there would hardly be anybody that we can get that I haven't played with.
Yeah.
And people want to connect, you know, because part of they've heard about some of the things that we've done here at Michigan State in jazz education, and people are really anxious to come here. I mean, people are calling us wanting to come, and for our limited budget, they're coming.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to ask you, when Hugh Masekela was here at the Wharton Center, he told a story about how Louis Armstrong heard about his student band in South Africa, and suddenly one of Louis Armstrong's trumpets arrives out of the blue. Do you have any story, inspirational kind of story you recall?
Well, I had a mentor by the name of Milt Hinton.
Oh.
And Milt Hinton, his nickname was the Judge, and the Judge is famous for taking photographs. So he has tons of books of photography that has come out over the last 30 years. But the most famous picture he took is of Billie Holiday with the drink in her hand. Oh. That's Milt Hinton's photos, one of his photos. But I met him when I was, I think, 22 maybe, on a recording session in New York for one of Spike Lee's films. And every day, I think it was 5 days of recording, and every day he had lunch with me, and he was interested in the way I thought about things, and he thought I was a smart kid. And we hung out, and on the last day of the recording, his wife showed up because he'd been talking about me all week. And at that time I had like a really inexpensive K bass, which is a good bass, but it's at that time very, very cheap bass, and I needed a good instrument. He actually tried to give me one, but I had too much pride to take it.
No kidding.
And but if I could go back in time, I would take the bass. but he was one of those people that was really encouraging and helped me get work, and wanted everybody to know me. And Rufus Reed and I were talking about Milt, and he was saying that Milt did that for everybody. Richard Davis, Ron Carter, all the great young bass players. When you moved to New York, if you met Milt Hinton, he would try to get you performances. But also, person I have a long association with is Wynton Marsalis, and I think the most interesting thing that I have a relationship with him is that we argue a lot, and he calls me sometime to argue. And
what do you argue about?
Everything,
politics.
Doing what we think is doing the right thing, what we should do in education, or just what's happening out here in the world, on the music scene. And it's inspirational to me that somebody of that stature respects me enough to call me to argue.
Yeah, that's great. Now, this show airs on Christmas Eve, and I know you have a traditional performance now on Christmas Eve. Tell me about it.
Well, I do a church service at Christ Church Cranbrook in Bloomfield Hills, and it's a Jazz Vespers performance. Well, I shouldn't say performance, but a jazz mass. And the idea is to, with their choir and my group, to play jazz versions of spiritual things. And it's so much fun. I grew up in that tradition. I grew up in the UCC church where jazz is a big part of. I think over the last 30 years, jazz has become a big part of their service. I think that church started Jazz Vesper services. And UCC church is really about social justice and change. And it was started from the Amistad case. And but part of it is that tradition is about everybody bringing their culture into the church, and so this is the Anglican church is where we're playing, and jazz is not a part of that tradition. So it's very interesting. The people in the community really love hearing the jazz, and I think it attracts more people to come out. I think jazz has been in the 20th century, 21st century, has been a powerful agent for social change in the world.
For example?
Well, in Eastern Europe, jazz was underground, and jazz was the music of rebellion. And if you wanted to rebel against the government, you became a jazz musician. Yeah. Or in the United States, the fact that State Department tours were done by jazz musicians.
I was going to mention one of my favorite recordings of all time is Dave Brubeck's The Real Ambassadors.
Oh, yeah.
And when Louis comes in, I'm in heaven.
That's it. But jazz has also been a way of people as an African American, it's been a way for people to understand my culture and my people in a way that they would not it helped them to see the humanity of the black man.
All right. Well, we can't go to the church with you, unfortunately, but we're going to get a little bit of music from you on this Christmas Eve. But before we do it, another thing I learned about you is you like peanut brittle.
I do. Oh,
Merry Christmas.
Thank
And
you.
You don't have to go to Traverse City for this. It's
Thank
right
you.
here in Lansing. We're going to take a break so Rodney can play some music for us to go out on. Rodney, thank you very much
Bill.
for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
My pleasure.
And Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. We'll be back with a new show first Saturday in January. And now here is Rodney Whitaker playing the song Beautiful Love.